I grew up on the east side of Detroit. In 1967, when I was 8, a white patina of smoke covered my city during the race riots. Tension erupted between blacks and whites after police raided a Blind Pig bar. There was looting, setting of fires, and shootings. National Guard tanks rolled through our downtown, and I could hear the rumbling. I felt a sense of terror that my city wasn't safe anymore. I tried to reconcile this by playing numbers with 8s. I was 8. The curfew time for the city was 8. The smoke rings from my mother's cigarette made 8s. To ease my fears, I read encyclopedias and reenacted riots with Ken and Barbie wielding paper cutout knives and torches under the eaves of our bungalow. My father was a homicide detective in the Detroit Police Department, so it was easy to pretend I was safe even when he wasn't around. I bragged at show and tell that no one was going to touch me because my dad slept with a gun every night. I opened the hall closet to see and touch his billy clubs, gas masks, and bulletproof vests. When no one was around, I opened the off-limits drawer and gently touched all the switchblades he'd confiscated. I would imagine him on a dangerous flaming block in Detroit, garbed in riot gear, jump-kicking the rioters, their switchblades flipping open in the air and landing safely in his palms. Even though I was afraid, having all these icons in our house somehow demystified the violence. Early on, I learned to live with massive contradictions, just as Detroit, then the per capita murder capital of the world, learned to live across the river from Windsor, Canada, a city with no murders. When I saw the Big Dipper at night, I truly wished for it to ladle goodness on our side of the Detroit River. The imagination to see things differently than they were began to line my mental bulletproof vest and has served me to this day when I face contradictory and improbable situations. Not long after the National Guard rolled through, forced desegregation swept through our schools like a massive tank. In the mid-'70s, when I was a freshman at Edwin Denby High School, I witnessed a mini riot right out in front of school. Whites lined one side of Kelly Road, blacks lined the other. I remember the brass knuckles and swinging nunchucks, the screaming, and that sense of fuzzy terror that dried saliva in my mouth, leaving me speechless and paralyzed. A telephone pole was knocked down, live wires dangling and stopping cars. Not weeks later, I heard the crack of gunshots as someone was murdered in front of school in a gang war. It was my first realization that being a homicide detective's daughter in Detroit didn't make me invincible by proxy anymore. The following year was my first homecoming dance. I can't remember what I wore, whether I wore nail polish, how I did my hair. It was all swallowed up in an amnestic fog as checkered tables in the hall were kicked over and chairs started flying. Guns popped off in the air as I ran out into the foyer to call my dad, collect. He was then lieutenant in charge of East Side Gang Patrol. In minutes, police were yelling over large megaphones for everyone to evacuate, and they started spraying tear gas. Kids were running everywhere, and gas swirled up like a thick white dream. School dance is forever wedded to tear gas and gangs in my brain's amygdala. There was a cop who patrolled from the roof of our high school, and another who searched our backpacks. I didn't even flinch when he exposed my tampons and had me put them back in front of everyone. One day, I saw someone stuff a rag in his gas tank, light it, and jump back in delight as his motorcycle blew up in the school parking lot. I felt a strange mixture of excitement and terror. After all, I was a cop's daughter, and I appreciated cops trying to keep us safe. But I was also a teenager, watching with excitement as a pig's motorcycle went up in flames. Afterwards, kids were in such a frenzy celebrating that they started throwing desks out windows of the school portables. Gang graffiti was everywhere. The BKs or Black Killers, the Errol Flynns named after the womanizing actor of the 30s, or one of my favorites, the Rob Dogs. A recipe for severe violence had been created by forced desegregation. Us kids have been raised to hate one another in a city with rabid racial polarization and severe economic downturn as the auto industry began its slow collapse. By the time I was in 11th grade, it became clear to me I had to do everything humanly possible to eventually get out of Detroit. I worked at the grocery store to buy a car. I was resourceful enough to know how much school I could skip and still pull B's to get through. In 12th grade, I missed a whopping 30 days of school without a problem. It was standard procedure for all of us to forge our parents' signatures so we could work to make money to get out of Detroit. It was our mantra to get out, and it vibrated in every cell of our bodies. There was a sense of exhilaration knowing I might have some control over the system and not end up a passive victim of a drive-by shooting, as my friend had been in front of the car repair shop the next street over. I kept an old steering wheel in my locker in high school, and when I felt that old Motown fear welling up in my stomach, I'd walk out in the hallways during class change and pretend to drive a car. After all, this was the Motor City. Friends would get in that imaginary car, all tightly huddled, and we'd drive down the halls as a mass, laughing like mad people trying to escape the asylum. The year after I graduated from high school, one of my teachers was stabbed in the lunchroom. I was now a freshman at Wayne State University in downtown Detroit, where things weren't much better. One day, my English professor was murdered in the same parking structure I parked in every day, the same structure where I had to chain my Dodge Dart's hood to prevent its battery from being stolen, and where I stood waiting for AAA one freezing winter night, waving off pimps driving up to proposition me. This was a defining time for me. I knew I was done with Detroit for good, and I put my life in high gear. I worked 2 jobs, one at the grocery store, one in a lab. I transferred to the University of Michigan and worked my way through college and then medical school to become an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. That sense of imagination that I developed early on certainly served me well to see things as having more than one solution. One night on weekend trauma call, I held the hand of a female gunshot victim with massive internal bleeding just before the anesthesiologist put her to sleep. She looked at me and asked, "Will I be all right?" I didn't know what would happen with exploratory surgery. I thought of my dad in his uniform and what he'd done to protect our family and city. I thought of how we learned to live from moment to moment, oftentimes not knowing what would happen next. And I said, yes, you will be all right.